Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, we're going to make ribbon and lace tidbits to use in our slow stitching. Now these are little elements that you can add to existing pieces. You can base a piece all around these or use an abundance of them to make a simple project. It combines scrap fabric, scrap pieces of lace, and a button that coordinates it all. And you can use multiple pieces of lace, multiple scraps, etc. You can modify this as you like. The beauty of this, and I use neutral colors for this, is that it really enhances what you already have and makes a cute little piece to use in your work. There's a little bit of dimension, some layering, and lots of texture. So let's get started. To start my little button and lace tidbits for my fabric little swatches, I chose some fabric that I'm going to use today, and I chose just a bunch of the same color because I like these to be neutrals, but feel free to use whatever color scheme you like. I just find the neutrals very effective for this technique. So here's one that I have yet to sew down. As you can see, I've got my base fabric, my little tidbit, and then a scrap of lace and a button that coordinates. And I did the same thing here, where I use charcoals as my neutral. So I really like the way this comes along. I also have another version to show you where I take the tidbits and I put them all together. So there's lots of repetition, there's lots of buttons, lots of lace. It coordinates because they're all neutrals, even though they're not the same necessarily, the same fabric. But it's a very effective technique. You can make a whole piece with them, or you can just use one little piece as just something to really accentuate your work. So let's get started. I'll set these aside. And I have my scraps here. I'll decide if I want to make multiple layers or just use this piece for the background in one layer. But before I do that, I like to gather my lace. So I keep a little cigar box with just little lace odds and ends here. And I have some lace that I dyed with some tea that caused it to go a little blue. Not a lot, but just a little bit. So I might use that. Or I can use some blue lace. I'll take it out and audition it. Or I could contrast it as well. So I like to do that together. So I have my pieces here. And I can just see which one really works for me. I kind of like this blue with the darker blue for contrast. So I'll get rid of this blue. And get rid of those laces. So now it's easy enough to start. So I'll decide how big I want each piece. And this is going to be the main part of my tidbit here. So I'll just cut this to size. It can be any shape really. I like to do a rectangular shape, and it doesn't have to be perfect. That looks pretty good. And now I want to cut my background piece. This has a little pinked edge, and I can leave that for an interesting design or cut it. I think I'll leave it for now. I can always trim it later. And since I really want to emphasize this being a rectangle shape, I'll maybe trim it a little further. It could easily be a square. I just happen to be in the mood for a rectangle, and that's why I chose to do that. And I like the contrast with these two denims. I also like the way that this denim, the line is running horizontally, and this one's vertically. It doesn't have to be that way, but I kind of like that. And now I have this ribbon here. Now because this frays, I could take advantage of the fraying and really emphasize that on the end of my piece, which is kind of an interesting effect. And if I didn't want that, I would just tuck it under. But I think I kind of like that little fraying. So I'll trim that down. And then I'll stitch it and then just pull it apart a little. So this is coming out really well. I like the way it built up layers, added a little dimension. So now I have some embroidery floss. I just went through whatever scraps I had that were blue. Doesn't have to be perfect. It somewhat matches the background. And I'm just going to stitch down around this dark blue denim. And when it comes to stitching this, I'll just stitch enough to tack it down on the edges, maybe 2 or 3 stitches. You can use any type of stitch you want. Just going to use a little running stitch. And I'll try and keep it really small. Because it's denim, you could always use a different element of using some goldish thread, just like you'd see on a pair of jeans. So you have a lot of options and a lot of things to play with here to make your piece really personal and your own. Now I'm using 2 strands of embroidery floss because I just wanted a slight effect. If I wanted a chunkier effect, I would have used all 6 strands. So I like these little stitches. They become a little design element, and they're really precious. I'll finish stitching all around this piece, and then we'll continue with the ribbon and the button. So this is how it looks when it's stitched down. It's just a very rough stitch, but I like it. It has the rough edge, the little tatters here. And now I just want to place my ribbon wherever I want it. I can do it right in the center. I can do it off center. For this one, I think I'm going to try and go in the center. So now I'm going to hold it in place. And again, since this isn't a perfect science here, I can have a little angle or not. This is where I get to decide what I want to do. I'll add just a few little stitches to tack it down. It doesn't even have to stay tacked down very strongly. It's not going to get a lot of wear and tear. But when I stitch that button into place, it will really hold it in position quite well. So I'll just do a few stitches around the ribbon, mostly on the sides, just a couple down the length of it. And now I'll just take my button. Now the beauty of using a button, aside from the element that it adds, is you can stitch it just like a standard button, a traditional button where you stitch inside the 2 holes. You could flip it over and use it that way, although I tend to think there's a little more interest with the recessed areas. Or you could stitch it holding it on the outside, and that's what I'm going to do, again, just for added interest. So I'm going to eyeball where I want it in place, and then I'm going to try and get my needle up and put it through one of the holes. Now over here I have a little bit of give. If I made it where I didn't want it, I can move it to the exact spot that I want and hold it down. And I'm going to stitch from the inside out. And I'll do this a couple of times. When I'm happy with where it is, I'm going to come up on the other side. And this time I'm going to come up from the outside. It just seems to be a little easier. And I'll stitch it a couple of times there too. So I could leave it like that, or I could stitch on the sides here. And I'm really actually quite pleased with this. I like the repetitive lines going horizontally. I'll stitch just a couple more times to really reinforce that button. I don't expect it to get a lot of handling, but I don't ever want to lose a button either. And now I'll just knot it on the back. Now from here, I want to make a little texture on the end of this ribbon. And it can't necessarily be done with all ribbons, but with this ribbon, it's a little stiff, so it can. So I'll just go in with a pin and pry off a couple of little strands. Then I can cut it down. And these are just the steps you take depending on the characteristics of the textiles that you use. Not all ribbons will work this way, and other ribbons will have different characteristics that will add interest to your piece. So that's the completed little button and lace tidbit. It kind of blends together. It doesn't really stand out as particularly lacy or particularly buttony, but I love using the neutrals along with those 2 elements. So that's how I make the ribbon and lace tidbits. I think they're cute little squares or rectangles. I'm sure you can use them in any shape. In today's video, we focused on the little simple rectangle. It's a cute effect, and it uses up your scraps and really makes something come alive. I think the combination of lace and buttons and fabric is just really beautiful and fun to work with. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.